Now the title of the paper is an H-infinity deconvolution filter and its application to ultrasonic non-destructive evaluation of materials. The title is intended to appeal to the widest range of audience possible. There are really three things going on in this paper. We're doing ultrasonic non-destructive evaluation, we're using a deconvolution filter, and specifically this filter is an H-infinity deconvolution filter. Now, there are basically three types of people that will be interested in this paper. People who are interested in ultrasonic non-destructive evaluation, or UNDE, might be interested in ways to process the data that they're acquiring, which would be our deconvolution filter. People who are interested in deconvolution might be interested in different types of deconvolution filters, so they might be looking at H-infinity filters, or they might be looking for applications of deconvolution filter, which would be the UNDE part. Finally, there are people who are looking into H-infinity filters in general. Those people might be interested in deconvolution. They might also be interested in applications of H-infinity filtering. Now let's go through the report itself. The abstract, I want to talk about that last because generally it's written last. It's the most important thing. It will contain a very brief synopsis of everything else that's in your report. This will generally be used by people to decide whether they need to read the rest of your report or whether it's something that's not of interest to them. The introduction generally comes right after the abstract. This section is intended to get people up to speed on the various topics of the report. So, since we have three possible different audiences, the audience can be unfamiliar with any or all of the buzzwords that are in the title. So first, we talk about non-destructive evaluation in general. Then we give an idea of ultrasonic non-destruction evaluation and the context of the problem we're trying to solve and the way we're trying to solve it. Next, there's some information on deconvolution methods in general. Finally, H-infinity deconvolution methods are introduced. Now, notice that the beginning of each of these paragraphs sets the stage for the rest of the paragraph. Within the first couple of words of the paragraph, you can figure out what that paragraph is going to be about and whether you really need to read it. In particular, these first four paragraphs give the background to the problem. The fifth paragraph provides a limitation to the current state of the art. H-infinity deconvolution filters haven't been applied to these types of problems. This is the segue to the topic of this particular paper. We're going to apply H-infinity deconvolution methods to this problem. So the problem gets set up, the shortcomings are noted, and then where this paper fits into that background comes into play. Finally, in this particular paper, I gave a brief synopsis of how the paper's laid out. Normally, I won't do that. I tend to think that the paper itself, its organization, should be self-explanatory. However, this paper has a lot of different data sets associated with it. There are different samples that have been tested. I felt like it was important to give an outline up front. The other thing that happens in the introduction is that you set the stage for what your knowledge is. There are a number of references wandering around in here. Okay, I'm illustrating that I know what's going on in this community, and I'm setting myself as being an expert and providing my qualifications for writing this paper. Journal articles tend to require this type of literature review. In general, in industry, you won't need to demonstrate your qualifications to this extent. The largest part of the report is the body. In this particular part, that starts out in section 2 and continues on up to section 5. Now the body is typically has the least predefined organization of any section of your report. Most reports will have an abstract, they'll have an introduction, they'll have a conclusions and recommendations section. Depending on the work that was done, the body, which gives your results and draws your conclusions and discusses your results in order to create those conclusions, that will be highly dependent on what problem and how you're approaching things. In my particular case, I started out with the formulation of the problem. Gives the background on how the testing was done. So it talks about the test procedure. It also places the text data in a mathematical context which will be used throughout the rest of the report. So the test procedure has gone through, it's put in the context of a block diagram how things are going to be modeled mathematically, and then some equations are given that give the mathematical model that will replicate this test procedure. So we're still kind of getting people up to speed on how we're going to represent things and what some of the theoretical aspects in relationship to the physical data acquisition are going to be. Next, we present our H-infinity deconvolution filter. So this provides the mathematical setup of how the filter is implemented and how the different parameters in the filter are set. Now this is kept as short as possible, even though it seems like this wanders along for quite some time. Really what I'm giving here is the upshot of what the filter parameters are going to be. I don't derive anything. What I do is relegate that derivation to an appendix, Appendix A. Most people probably won't need to see the derivation unless they're really interested in modifying the approach, or if they think they've implemented something wrong, or if they think there's a typographical error in these equations here that's making them not come up with the results they should be coming up with. In this particular report, the longest section is results and discussion. This contains all of the experimental results, the analysis that was done on those experimental results, and a discussion as to what the conclusions can be made from that analysis and those experimental results. This has a number of different subsections in it, mostly associated with the different materials that were tested and how they were tested. All the results are given in the form of figures. Okay, we don't see long tables of data here. Humans are visual people. They need to see stuff that they can relate to. Generally, that's going to be a picture. So another sample and frequency combination, more results. Now that we've got our results and discussed them, we can move on to the conclusions and recommendations. Conclusions and recommendations can be, and often are, in two separate sections, one for the conclusions and one for the recommendations. I generally consider the recommendations to follow, hopefully, directly from the conclusions, so I'll often put them in a single section. The difference between conclusions and recommendations is that the conclusions follow directly from the results presented in the body of the report. If your reader agrees with those results, they kind of have to agree with your conclusions, unless you're just not making any sense. Recommendations are more subjective. They generally are associated with how the author feels about what was done and what additional work generally would need to be done to make it better. So this first paragraph or two are all the conclusions. The next part gives some recommendations as far as future work. This in a journal article will set the stage for future research. In an industry type article, generally it's a request for additional funds if necessary to do more follow-on work because the author isn't comfortable with what's done. Finally, the referencers are listed, and this is the derivation of the filter parameters. Very few people are going to go through this. There's no point in putting it in the body of the report. Now let's go back to our abstract and see how that fits in. The abstract's a really short summary of everything that's in the report. It sets the stage for why the problem should be done. Okay, this is the why stuff. Here's what was done. A new H-infinity filter is presented and it's applied to typical ultrasonic non-destructive evaluation data. So why it was done, what was done and what the results were. Okay, we did the stuff with the H infinity filter. We compared it with the results from kind of a standardized filter called a Wiener smoother, and the performance is comparable between the two. That's really about all there is to it.